run through some questions with us. And then at the end, we are hoping to have about 10-15 minutes for questions. So if you think of any questions during the session, please feel free to type them into the chat box, or at the end, we can also do virtual raising hands, and then we'll ask you to invite you to unmute yourself and ask your questions to the panelist. So today's session is looking at prospecting do's and don'ts, and we have a wide range of experience in our panel across their careers, from small charities to quite big organisations. So hopefully we will get an insight across the board of how donor prospecting looks in different organisations. I'd like to introduce Simon Jenkins, Kat Havers and Fiona Bushfield. And if you wouldn't mind, one at a time, it would be lovely if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and your experience. So Simon, would you mind your first on my screen, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting yourself and saying hello to everyone.
Hello, can you hear me? Good. I'm Simon Jenkins. I'm Development Director at Bristol Old Vic. I work alongside a team of 2, and prior to working at Bristol Old Vic, so I started in January 2019. I've been there now for 4 years, 4 years as of last week. Prior to that, I worked at Northern Ballet in Leeds, where I did previously work in a prospect research specific role. And then before that, I worked at Yorkshire Sculpture Park in a role which I sort of conceived as a research sort of focused role. So I have some grounding in prospect research, but in the last sort of 2-3 years, I've kind of moved away from that. So I'll probably be learning as much today as anybody else.
Thank you ever so much. Fiona, welcome.
Okay, thanks. So I am the research officer at the National Gallery. So I work within a relatively large development team to kind of support the fundraisers with their asks and approaches. And I'd say that my research is kind of split into like 3 key elements, and that would be identifying new prospects, creating profiles and briefings, and then also kind of like the risk assessment and due diligence side of things as well. So yeah, I'm really interested to hear about, well, I'm relatively new to prospect research. I've been here about 4 months, so it'd be really interesting to see how things work in a smaller organisation as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Fiona. And Kat, welcome.
Morning, everyone. So I'm Kat. I'm head of philanthropy at a national charity called Onside. My background is in university higher education fundraising as a major and principal gift fundraiser. So I'm used to, up until May last year when I joined Onside, I was used to having a whole prospect research function. So it's not my background, but in May last year I joined Onside. We've got about 50-60 people in our charity. We build state-of-the-art youth centres all around the country, and so we've got 14 so far, and we're quite rapidly growing, but started as a small organisation. So at Onside we have no internal prospect research function, so I am very quickly having to get up to speed with you know, the intricacies of it, and then also training new fundraisers on it as well. So that's my background.
Thank you, Kat. Wonderful. Well, it looks like we've got a whole heap of experience on our panel today. So I'm going to crack on with the first question. And that is, what does donor prospecting mean to you and your charity? And I think that's, we're looking at across the whole board, whether you're a solo fundraiser working for a really small charity, or whether, as you have mentioned, you're part of a bigger organisation that has actually a prospecting team. We'd love to know, who do you talk to first? What's your first approach? Who would like to go first? Simon, were you happy to go first?
I can go first, yeah. I mean, that first part of your question about size of organisation, to some extent I would say that it makes a difference, but ultimately I feel like it probably doesn't. I think it's relative to the sort of fundraising goal that you would be charged with anyway. Certainly that's what I found. So having come from a team where prospect research was a luxury, to then going into a team where I was a dedicated prospect research person, the importance of prospect research was never in doubt. And I think ultimately the responsibilities of prospect research kind of get subsumed into your day-to-day responsibilities if you're a solo fundraiser anyway. Yeah, it's something that I think is just very, very part of the day-to-day activity of being a fundraiser, I'd say. Yeah.
And Simon, who would you talk to first when you're prospecting? How do you make your first approach? Do you have any tips there?
I'm very much someone, certainly from my previous experience, of being quite passive when it comes to sort of initial prospect research. So normally what would happen is there would be a brief about what we need funding for a specific project. That would come from development lead or from exec. And then I would go away and do basically a whole ton of research on whatever free resources I can get my hands on. Google Advanced Search is your best friend for this, and Charity Commission website, Funding for All, and feed that into regular meetings with development leads. I think over time, with experience, I've come to realize that actually communicating with other department leads is probably the best way of going about it. Because ultimately, as is the case with anything in fundraising, it's all about relationships, it's all about communication. I think what I was trying to get at before in a very waffly way about it being about the day-to-day is that prospect research is an extension of that. It's kind of almost par in terms of picking up the phone and talking to someone about something that they might be interested in. I think you get as much out of doing that as you would from building up some vast Excel spreadsheet of people that may or may not be interested in the project that you're looking for support for.
Great, thank you. How about over to you, Kat? Especially coming from a very large organisation, and now you said you've got a smaller team for prospecting. It'd be lovely to hear your thoughts.
Just to kind of clarify the situation on side, because it's a little unusual. So I manage a team of fundraisers who are based all across the country, fundraising for new use zones. And so Bristol is one of them, for example. That person will be the sole major gift fundraiser, the sole fundraiser for onside within that region. So they are essentially working for very, very small charities, even though they're part of onside. So I have to support the team in kind of reaching out into their local communities, and if they don't already know the business communities, and just to clarify, I'm talking largely about corporates and major individual donors rather than trusts and foundations. I'd very much be supporting them to get out to networking events. That's a really, really key one. Working with the board and identifying influencers, that's the first kind of point of call, I think, quite often for that. And it's going back to what Simon's saying about that relationship building. Prospecting being part of everybody's job, not just the fundraiser or if you have a prospect researcher. So really training board and senior volunteers to understand what prospect might look like, may not always be their preconceived ideas, what are the signs, and how to kind of communicate that back to the fundraisers or act in it in the most appropriate way. And so beyond the networking events and influencers, I'd also, we use Credit Safe, which is, we'd use more to look at companies, for example, with pre-tax profits over 1.5 million. And that will give us a really good idea of those kind of local SMEs who might be really invested in their community, but might not be the kind of traditional prospects that everybody else is kind of looking for. And that works particularly well with because we do youth work in the community. It tends to align with quite a lot of local businesses, but that's quite a key one for us. Just being able to look at the financials and decide which companies to look into, and then network mapping. Who knows, the MD of those companies or particular individual? Can the board help with connections in?
Great, thank you. Well, I'd never heard of Credit Safe before, so I'm making notes as we go along, because that sounds like something I'd like to look into. Fiona, how would you like to join?
Sure. So as I said, I work within a relatively large development team. So I'd say that my role kind of accounts for perhaps like one part of the process, I'd say. So it's really, as I said, like the identifying the kind of individual profiles, the briefing, and then the risk assessment elements. But I also try to kind of support and inform as much as possible in how to make the approaches and the ask. So how much to ask, like when to ask, like to do the homework and really find a specific project that will be really appealing to the person that we are trying to approach. So in that sense, I suppose it would be slightly different to a smaller organization where the fundraiser might be doing some of the research, because we each kind of account for like a separate part of the process. But because the team is relatively large, it means that the support that I'm giving is quite varied, because it could be for like corporate support for the corporate team, or like major donors or patrons, or, you know, our youngest supporters. So the kind of support that I'm providing does vary quite significantly between the different, you know, the different teams that I'm supporting. In terms of like finding new prospects, because it's quite like we have quite a loyal and dedicated supporter pool, but in terms of finding new people, I'd say, I mean, I'm sure most charities do this, but it's always looking at peer organisations and what's going on there, and looking at similar projects that are being supported in different places and keeping on top of that as well. So I guess market research, and always just making sure that I'm up to date with anything that's going on in peer organisations, and especially with donors that might be interested, that have, you know, that I notice on various like wealth ratings that might have an interest in the arts as well, and just keeping on top of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat here. Sort of, I think it was Simon who mentioned looking out for signs of people who might be interested. What kind of things are you looking for?
Probably, I mean, touching upon what Fiona was just talking about there, it's any kind of evidence that you can find that's public and legal, predominantly online, that indicates a preference for the aims, mission, objective of the organisation that you're fundraising for. And in terms of where you would find that information, peer organisation websites, but also annual accounts are your best friend as far as prospect research is concerned. And actually, I would argue that generally in fundraising, it's something that I keep asking for training on, and I've been doing it for however many years I've been fundraising for, 7 years. Because probably ultimately the root of all that information, all those signs, you'll find in annual accounts for a trust or from Companies House. With individuals, I guess that's slightly more difficult. I mean, that's much more kind of geared towards either talking to them in person or getting those signs from the gatekeeper, the go-between, be that someone on your board, development committee, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think Kat may have been mentioning that as well. So perhaps Kat, could you just add to that question? Who are you, what are you looking out for?
Yeah, and I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective of thinking about the more kind of when you're in conversation with somebody or a board member meets somebody, and that would be more around kind of signs of their capacity. If they mention what school their children go to, obviously their job and industry is a massive one. So one thing that I've found really useful, I was lucky enough when I've worked in university fundraising, is to have training by our prospect research team on particular industries. So I worked a lot with prospects and donors in private equity and finance. It's a world I know nothing about, really. So I had some really fantastic training on just the mechanics of how it works, when bonuses are paid. And that really helped me just become a lot better at working with those individuals and understanding their situation, and when not to approach them when they were, and when to approach them. So I think if you have the ability to kind of either bring in external resource or even do a bit of digging yourself just on how particular industries structure their pay and reward systems, that can be really helpful. There's obvious signs around wealth, but another thing that I find very, very useful is putting the idea forward of how much other donors give, and gauging their reactions on that. And I appreciate that's maybe not strictly prospect research, but it's an absolutely key one. We had someone recently who just gave 100 grand like it was just spare change down the bottom of the back of the sofa. And, that's a big sign, isn't it, that there might be capacity to ask for a little bit more there in the future. So I think if you can bring giving into the conversation early and just flag gift amounts, it's not necessarily making an ask, but it's putting amounts out there, gauging their reaction can be very useful as well.
Thank you very much. I think a couple of you have mentioned the idea of bringing in other teams in the organisation. So how do you go about doing that? And indeed, how do you involve people who are not involved directly in fundraising, people who are perhaps at the front line of your organisation, who may even be the first person somebody mentions giving a gift to? So how do you bring them in and give them confidence to be able to make the ask or start that conversation? Should we start with Kat this time first?
I was thinking about this the other day in terms of working with boards, and you have some people who are very gung-ho with asking, and sometimes that needs a little bit of support. The enthusiasm's great, but actually helping them see the bigger picture. And I think in that kind of situation, a really useful tool can be to involve them in the cultivation planning of a prospect, to help them see where are we trying to get to long term, not asking for a small amount in the short term, but actually where are we trying to reach, and help it and involving them in that plan. So I use kind of template cultivation plan documents and bring them on board, and I think that can kind of keep that enthusiasm there, but help focus them on the longer term picture. Sometimes with major gifts that's needed. For people that are more nervous about even having a conversation, or regardless of asking for money, even just broaching the conversation, I'm very keen to frame it around what your job is to focus on the vision of the charity and why you're involved and your enthusiasm for it, and all you're doing is talking to them about why you're involved and what the kind of long-term vision is, and your job is to get them excited. And I find focusing some nervous volunteers on that kind of thing can be helpful, because sometimes people have a preconceived idea that you have to shove them in a room and they're going to have to ask for £1 million and it's going to be awful. But actually tuning into what they really love and what they're passionate about can be a useful tool.
Thank you. That's Fiona next.
Yeah, sure.
Organisation.
So as I said, we have quite a large fundraising team at the gallery, but it's really important to us that individuals that aren't necessarily trained in fundraising know and are comfortable with talking about sponsorship and support. Because, for example, like some of our patrons might come in and want to meet with a curator, or like someone from the exhibitions team, or someone in the conservation department. So it's really important to have those conversations with staff members to kind of steer them in the right direction as to how we would want that conversation to potentially go, and that they're comfortable having those conversations. So to support that, I would kind of provide like briefing notes before events, or like private exhibition tours, and that kind of thing, just so we can like point the staff member in the right direction to be like, they're interested in this thing and this is your area of expertise, and this is kind of how we're hoping the conversation would go. In terms of, so we also have our board of trustees, which we do provide fundraising training for, just to make sure that they are comfortable acting as ambassadors for the gallery and fundraising for us in line with our kind of ethical fundraising policy. So that's really important as well. And we also always let them know how they can kind of help us in terms of their network and in that way as well.
Thank you. Simon.
Yeah, I mean, all great points from Fiona there. I mean, I would kind of just echo that, really, to be honest. I think, I mean, generally one thing I've been trying to do internally is to kind of brief all departments in the organisation on what our department actually does. I make a very clear kind of intro about what does development mean, what does fundraising mean, and then kind of branch out from that in terms of how it impacts upon different departments, because it ultimately is as important for the person that's working on box office who gives the tickets to one of our donors who's coming to a production as it is to someone who's backstage who might be doing a tour for one of our donors who's interested in that aspect of what we do. And again, kind of supporting what Catherine was saying before about keeping those individuals informed as well. Briefing notes, kind of cheat sheets to tell them what it is that our mission is in terms of fundraising, what the kind of the areas that we're focusing on and the amounts that we're needing, and where they feel like they can best apply themselves in terms of their own kind of expertise, giving those trustees big lists of contacts. Just to come back to something that we were talking about before, another tip that I would suggest is actually looking at really specific job titles across companies. So anyone with business development in their title is always like a good go-to in terms of making that cold approach as far as corporate prospect research is concerned. And then giving those contact details to, or just showing that name to trustees to a development committee. So yeah, I think generally it's good practice both externally and internally to be transparent. I mean, it's true of anything really, I guess. And I think we've certainly found in recent months that by doing that, it's borne out results. We had an event last night where it really showed how important it was that we had a kind of a briefing meeting prior, where we assigned people to the prospects that were coming, and whoever it was from our engagement department or from our exec or marketing or producing knew who they had to talk to. And there was a point where I was looking around the theatre last night and I could see them all talking to the people that we wanted them to talk to. They knew what they had to talk to them about. So yeah, it's kind of all fairly obvious stuff, I guess, just like making sure to do plenty of prep research in advance and make sure that everyone's briefed and they know that what it is we're trying to do. It all seems quite obvious, but I suppose sometimes, certainly when you're in a smaller team, it's obviously that time balance is tricky to manage.
Thank you. So actually a follow-up question from that is about events and what kind of events you're organising for your prospects, and indeed sort of do they know, so that that's just following on from Judith's question, do they know that they're coming to be asked, if you know what I mean, for money?
I mean, I would go as far as to say that if you're getting a message from or a communication from a development or fundraising team, however they're being styled, then to an extent I would argue that in the back of your mind you're aware that you're I was going to say being ambushed, that sounds awful, but like, but it is probably, there is a grain of truth in that. And I think also, like, as I said about being transparent, there is an element of that where maybe it's worth embracing it almost. So like being quite overt, like not sort of to the point where it's obscene, but kind of, we've had lots of events recently where we've been trying to kind of grow our membership base. We launched a new membership scheme last year, and we've kind of really gone all out to see members in person and to kind of really be quite kind of overt in terms of what the scheme is, how it directly impacts upon what we do, and importantly showing them visually the pathway of support, so they can start from this level of member and then try and grow them up to a point where they're giving us more money and it's specifically going towards a particular area that they want to support. And we found from having those more frank, transparent, honest conversations that it's elicited really positive results. You know, it's a far more sort of American form of philanthropy, I guess, which we're not particularly comfortable with here. But as long as it's all above board, you know, you've got their details, they've shown an interest in signing up, and they've all come to an event, then beyond that point, I think it's all fine.
So, Fiona, do you have anything to add to that as a large organisation organising events?
Gosh, yeah, we have a lot of events. Like, all of our like different supporter groups. I mean, we have lots of different kind of like supporter levels at the gallery, and lots of different schemes, and we would kind of hold like regular events, particularly for a new program that we launched very recently for to kind of try and engage a younger audience at the gallery. It's kind of a program for young donors under 40. And as part of that, we invite them to kind of networking events at the gallery and give them other various benefits as well. The one thing that I would say is that as part of the cultivation process at the gallery is that we would always let the person know, in the first instance, that the reason why we are contacting them is because we're trying to cultivate them. So there's no, like they know that we are like inviting them to things, hosting events, etc., because we do want a donation from them. The process, especially with kind of major donations, can take, there's no set time frame. Like it can take, months, it could take much longer than that. But the one thing that we are very clear on is the fact that we are pursuing them because we do want a donation from them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. I love that honesty, and I think that's really, really important. I think what's really interesting that all of you have touched on is we often say it that, everybody in our organisation needs to be a fundraiser to some extent. I think, Kat, you touched on that, saying prospect. I've never thought of it that way, but prospecting really, in a way, is part of everybody's job. And I love, Fiona, how you mentioned kind of giving people the kind of tools and having, the kind of briefing documents in place so that, anybody that's there, touching base with a potential donor has some tools and is able to start those early conversations. So thank you. Yeah, really interesting. Next question we wanted to ask is a bit of a scenario question. It's about how you might engage a new audience, I suppose. Whether it's you're working for a small charity, a tiny charity that's maybe setting up their first individual giving program, they don't really have anything in place yet, or maybe as a much larger organization, you're looking at a new supporter base because there's a new specific project. I mean, you've just touched on this a little bit, Fiona, in your last question, in your last answer, sorry. But we're kind of looking for your maybe top 5 tips on how you frame that first conversation with those people and how you engage them. Who'd like to go first? Simon.
I'll be honest, I kind of struggled with this. But then I suppose that's kind of not unusual. I mean, in terms of that first conversation, I kind of stand a little bit by what I've just said and what Fiona was just talking about as well. I think ultimately it benefits from, being quite not upfront, in a sort of potentially kind of obstructive way, but being honest with someone. And more to the point, I think ultimately it benefits both parties' time if you've done the work to find out what they're interested in and put the time in to find something that matches their interests, and having that very sort of organic conversation about how their support is best placed, and then they're far more likely to give in the longer term more sustainably than having some much more short-term kind of relationship that's much more about just firefighting for whatever kind of short-term campaign you're trying to fundraise for. So yeah, certainly kind of building on everything that's already been mentioned. In terms of actually growing a prospect base, I mean, I always sort of defer to kind of the tools that I've always been most comfortable with. And another one I would mention is LinkedIn, that I've kind of used a lot more recently since I found out that you can change the settings on LinkedIn so that people don't see that you've been on their account, which sounds quite creepy, but it's still allowed. It's okay to do that. So using things like LinkedIn Charities Commission, if you can pay for it, funds online as well, so Directory for Social Change, and just building up those names. I think getting to a point where the names of individuals, trusts and corporates all become quite familiar, and matching them closely to what you're doing at the organisation and making everyone familiar with those names will take you quite a long way to get to the point where you're building something that eventually, 1 or 2 of those might become a donor from a prospect. But yeah, it's incredibly hard, I would say, to grow it from scratch. Another thing potentially is to go through archives, to go through historic donor records and to see if there's any dormant donors that might be interested in reactivating their support. Again, kind of employing that sort of tactic of trying to engage them directly in what they're interested in, and just generally being far more kind of approachable in terms of communication.
Thank you, Simon, and sorry for jumping into you again, first of all. Fiona, how about in your role? And I appreciate it might not actually fall directly in your role, but how about within your team? How, if there's a new project or something new and you're needing to look for a new potential supporters, how do you go about it?
So it really depends on the project. And I would say generally in terms of finding new prospects, one way we do that is by creating new projects or kind of schemes. So for example, I think I touched on like the young ambassador scheme that we'd started, but we also recently started a scheme for like to create a more international donor base, particularly US based, that we kind of wanted to implement to bring new people to support the gallery. But it really depends on the project that we have, really. I mean, for things that we have in place that are applicable to other peer organizations, such as we have a big NG200 kind of capital project coming up to mark our bicentenary, we would look at similar supporters of other projects at peer organizations. It's very situation specific. Like if there's an exhibition with a contemporary artist that might have a particular fan base that we could tap into, or I don't know, they went to like a particular university, and like we could look at things like that. But there's obviously quite a creative element to prospecting in that way. But one thing I would say for this question is really kind of trying to understand your audiences and the people supporting you, and like looking at how the projects that they're supporting kind of like the user experience, in a sense, like looking at how people use the gallery, trying to really understand what they might want, and like how we can kind of create new people to come, like launching like different programs that are slightly like we have like a more modern branch that we put in place recently to bring a slightly different user base to the gallery, and along that bring new people to support the gallery as well.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm just going to jump in with a question really quickly. Kat, I'll come to you in a second. But one of the questions that's popped up in the chat is related to something you've just mentioned. Are alumni lists a good source of prospects? And you've just touched on that. So I wondered if anybody has any experience of using alumni lists to increase their database.
I think, again, it is probably very charity specific, but in our case, it very much depends on the project and like the link to the university, or like why we want them to support the project in that way, if that makes sense. So we wouldn't just kind of like download a whole list of names. Like there'd be reasons as to why we would go in that direction for the specific project that we might use, if that makes sense. It's not like a like a blanket thing that we would use them for everything.
And great, thank you. Kat.
Yeah, so I'm coming at this question from the perspective of I'm supporting a fundraiser who's fundraising to open a new youth zone in an area, Bristol, for example. We have no presence there. We, in the first instance, are only looking for gifts of 75 grand or above. So that's the kind of context I'm coming from, and that will be from individuals and businesses. So my key focus would always be who are those influencers in that community, and that fundraiser, knowing the ins and outs of that community and the politics and who the key players are is absolutely key. We are lucky in that all our youth zones are done in partnership with the local authority. So we usually work with for example, the leader of the council and key members of the local authority, and they can be really helpful in opening doors. Local community foundations can sometimes be, well, we always try and connect, and they can be really helpful, really good to connect in with. And then, as I say, the kind of business organisations, so the LEP or the CBI, so who are the key people in the business community, how do you link into them and get in that, to those events, but in a really targeted way, so you're meeting the people that you need to meet with. I would then use those individuals to open doors for us. So, I'd have my list from Credit Safe and the prospect research, desk-based prospect research. These are the key people we want to target and reach out to. How do we then get the influencers to open those doors for us? And then it would be a case of either a meeting with the leader of the council or an influencer, or a coffee between the fundraiser and the prospect. In terms of how I frame that conversation and how I'd encourage others to think about it is, of course, being upfront that we're fundraisers. We need support to make this project happen, but I'd also frame it very much around wanting to understand more about their own priorities and philanthropic interests. From what I understand, there might be some overlap with what we're hoping to achieve in Bristol, Crewe, Preston, and what your focus is with your philanthropy. And then really focusing on, this is our vision for the future. This is the difference that we want to make in Bristol, in this area. And this is the support we need to make that happen, or this is what people like you or businesses like you are doing to enable that. And then I'd also frame it around understanding, I really want to come and meet you to talk to you to understand whether there's potential for us to work together, that kind of, raising fundraising, but not making them necessarily feel that you're going to be jumping and asking for lots of money in the first meeting. And it's partly about getting to know them and developing a relationship. So that's a slightly different angle, but hopefully might be of interest to some fundraisers.
Thanks ever so much, Kat. Emma?
Yes, yeah. We did wanted to, sorry, I was just responding to a message as well. We've talked a bit about sort of, how we work with our warm contacts, but what about when you've kind of got to the end of your list? How do you start working on colder contacts? How do you reach out to new audiences, sort of, and make that first ask? I don't know, Kat, do you want to go first?
I think, yeah, that kind of how the situation I just described is part of that. One thing, and this is always going to be charity dependent, but we find, because we're quite often coming into new areas, and we bring youth, essentially we're youth provision for the local area. People existing organisations get quite nervous that we're going to come in and hoover up all the youth funding or go and approach all the same people that have already given. And of course we will partly focus on that, but we focus a lot on it with our campaigns on bringing new SMEs on board, and that's where that credit safe tool for us is really useful. And looking at those building firms, flooring firms, scaffolding companies that have a turnover of a certain amount, they may be philanthropic. Quite often what we're asking them to do is far higher than they've ever given to anything else before. But once we've done the work to really help them see the impact that the youth zone will have in their community, and I'm sure lots of your charities, have that impact in different ways, once they can really see that, they understand the value of supporting it. And I think for us, that's quite an important, almost like new revenue stream beyond the traditional organisations or individuals that are usually approached. So that's something I'd recommend looking at if you think you can make that fit with what your charity does.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, I'd kind of just support what Catherine was just saying there in terms of existing service providers that your charity might already be working with, so suppliers and the kind of people that you already have a dialogue with for maybe largely commercial reasons, and exploring if there's a potential to add to that relationship and make it a kind of combined commercial and philanthropic relationship. I mean, it's quite straightforward for a charity arts organisation such as ours that's got a catering and trading arm, so we can kind of speak to our drink suppliers, that kind of thing, and talk about how they can support us in kind. To what extent can that help us in terms of fundraising targets? One thing I'd also add in terms of looking further afield, looking at peer organisations and seeing what, if any, support they get from abroad. Certainly in terms of the arts, that's something that you see quite a lot, particularly in visual art, I would say. And seeing what, if any, possibility there is in terms of going to those trusts, and also looking at, in a similar sort of manner to changing a commercial or evolving a commercial relationship to a philanthropic one, looking at trusts or sort of philanthropic arms of companies that may not necessarily state they support the work of your charity in terms of like the discipline. So in terms of like, in our example, like going to waste management companies that don't state that they support like arts organizations, but they support, let's say, I don't know, the environmental work that we're currently doing at Bristol Old Vic. And we can see that they do that at other organizations, and using that as a kind of a gateway kind of conversation to have. So I've done that quite a lot recently, where I've kind of sent emails or made phone calls to the council or to various sort of professional services companies, whatever, and said, you know, we're doing this thing that, you know, you can kind of set a precedent for in terms of supporting, in terms of being this company's first arts charity. So yeah, thinking outside the box in terms of who traditional supporters are for your charity.
Fiona, you've got anything to add? I'm sure that's something you do a lot of in your work.
Yeah. Yeah, so to echo what Catherine and Simon have said, but kind of coming from the perspective of, you know, conducting prospect research as an isolated role, we always have like kind of like a loyal and diverse group of supporters who perpetually support the gallery, but we're always on the lookout for finding new prospects, which is a large part of my role, you know, doing the research, doing network research in particular, always looking for kind of people who are supporting similar institutions to ourselves, just always keeping on top of it, particularly for people who have you know, an interest in like a specific, you know, artistic, you know, exhibition or movement that relates specifically to our gallery. So it's really important to always know what's going on. I think I kind of touched on this already with like younger audiences and bringing in new people, like creating like new platforms to bring these people in to the gallery is really important. But a large kind of way that we would find new people is through network and network research. I think that would be a key thing. And we're always on the lookout for people who, if they're not able to support the gallery in their own right, might be able to act as influencers on our behalf. So kind of utilizing their network in that sense to reach out to new people and explore different avenues. But yeah, so just always keeping on top of that and looking out for people who, despite not being able to support us, might be able to help the gallery in other ways as well.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Fiona, that's really interesting, because often I think working for maybe a smaller organisation, when you're desperately going out and trying to seek potential donors, you often don't have time to think about maybe the bigger picture of what you might be able to get from their wider networks when you're having to really focus on bringing income in, and obviously your targets are much smaller and things, but yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you. I'm really aware we are beginning to run out of time, because we do want to have some questions at the end, but there has been a couple of questions that have popped up regarding GDPR, so we're just going to finish off with one last question to ask you, you all. How do the current rules and regulations around GDPR, consent, legitimate interest, in a fundraising context, how does that affect the way that you prospect, and especially in regards to the kind of this cold donor engagement? If you've got any hints, that would be wonderful. Fiona, let's start with you first.
Sure. So I think with major donor fundraising, we operate on like a slightly different basis. So like we would, as I said, we'd always rely on a network to make an approach. We wouldn't contact them by any other means than through a pre-existing network. And in any case, we'd make sure that as soon as we had identified them, like I would provide research to make sure that the correct network was in place. We had the correct way of approaching them for the right and you know, a suitable ask amount, and for the right project, so that when we eventually do approach them through our networks, you know, we've done the homework to make sure it's something that they're really, really excited and happy to support. And I mean, the process could take, you know, however long it's going to take. We would find that, you know, with major fundraising, imposing strict deadlines isn't necessarily helpful. It's not to say we don't keep track of it. We, you know, we like log it all on our system, and we have targets which we review regularly. But in terms of reaching out to them, it's a really kind of careful and considered process of thinking about how we might best be able to do it, and what the most effective way of doing that might be through the networks that we already have, and just kind of drawing on our contacts as an institution.
Thank you. Kat, what would you like to add to this?
What I found really interesting that I think since coming to Onside, I think we do very well here is the peer-to-peer introductions. Now that can be, it's not without its complications, because I think sometimes our senior volunteers or peer-to-peer instructions, they don't understand GDPR. So we have to offer a little bit of ad hoc training to some of our senior volunteers on that stuff, and just be really clear about what we can and can't do. But getting them to speak to their friends, getting our warmest donors to speak to their friends and contacts is a really kind of key focus for us, and that is one, we're very successful in doing that. What I think is also important is training the fundraisers really clearly on asking for consent on organisational contact. And I think having worked in a university, we were very strong on that. We had a prospect research team, we would get training regularly. What do the fundraisers need to be asking for in terms of consents? Obviously at a university, you also have the alumni connection. So there's some connection there already. So I think for me, moving to an organisation that doesn't have that, it's been really important to ensure that all the fundraisers are really aware of, almost, not quite script, but what are the things that you need to make sure that you're ticking off when you're asking someone if we can kind of basically add their details to our database after that initial contact. And likewise, having in our email signature, our privacy policy, and making sure that everybody has, even on a cold approach, they should have always be able to access that policy, and that should be on the first point of contact with them. But there are differences between contacting people on business email addresses and businesses than kind of personal emails as well. So again, just making sure the fundraising team are really well trained on that.
Great, thanks ever so much. Simon, have you got anything to add, or has it already been covered?
Well, no, I mean, that's all very good, but I mean, one thing I would just add on a more sort of holistic level is that ultimately you're going to benefit far more from having warm contact than cold contact. So in a way, the influence of GDPR is you can see it as a benefit in that regard. There will be occasions when you need to make a cold contact, and obviously, the right thing to do is to go to a legitimate email address rather than finding a personal email address and using that. But ultimately, I think in the long term, it benefits from waiting until the opportunity arises to make that warm contact, because ultimately that's going to be a far more sustainable way in which to get support than from spamming loads of cold contacts and potentially upsetting a lot of people along the way.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Simon. I think that's been a key concern of all of us for the last few years. I think, Sophie, you've got to scoot off. So thank you very much for helping chair this for now. We've got a couple of questions just in our last few minutes. One in particular, which I think is quite a useful sort of carry on from the conversation that we've been having, which is about how you understand your donor satisfaction in terms of their journey, and how that would influence the way in which you go about your prospecting. I think this is Alex. I don't know if this was something you asked. Is that something you want to add to?
Yeah, I just wondered if it's something that you do, if you go out to your current donors to find out about their satisfaction, but also if you're ever transparent with them in terms of asking them about their advice and looking for new donors and prospecting.
I mean, that's definitely something that we're trying to do more of, and it kind of feeds into the kind of the sort of the cross-organizational approach of being upfront with all of our external stakeholders about the business of the organization. Yeah, I think that's absolutely something that we should all try to aim to do.
Kat, something that you do, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to add in, absolutely your warmest donors who are comfortable with it being kind of your key volunteers as well to bring on their networks. Another thing I've done in the past, this was in a university context, but I think it could be translated in some way with senior trustees, for example. The university was ramping up its fundraising and to kind of support the Vice-Chancellor and other senior staff and understanding how fundraising worked. What a session that I put on was actually bringing one of my donors to the meeting and asking my donor to talk through his experience of giving to the university from when he was very first contacted all the way through to his major gifts that he'd given, the relationship, putting myself on the spot a bit, the relationship with the fundraiser, you know, and all of those parts. And I think those senior staff at the university who were learning about fundraising, it was very helpful for them to understand donor motivations, what actually interests the donor, not what we think interests the donor. You know, all of that was, I think, a useful experience for them in their learnings of how philanthropy works, but also that donor loved it. You know, he felt like an insider, and it was really nice that it was a nice thing for him and developing that relationship with him as well.
Fiona, do you have some insight as part of a much larger team? Is this something that your team follows up at all?
Yeah, I mean, coming from, as I said, the perspective of just, having, the kind of isolated role within the organization, I would like to probably echo what Simon and Catherine said, but I know that in terms of our, supporter groups and our events, the people in development that work with those specific groups are always looking for regular feedback after each event, and always just trying to kind of take on board anything that might be useful to bring forward to the next event. And also in terms of like people they encourage people to regularly bring guests along, which is a really great way to kind of use those networks and bring new people to the gallery and just kind of spread the word about the services that we provide as part of patronage at the gallery.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat. Have you got any advice for somebody who, may be disabled and unable to get out? What kind of prospect researching can they do to support the charity that they're involved with? What are there online things that people can do or other forms of research? I don't know, Simon, do you want to go first?
Yeah, in terms of online, that's kind of that was always my default, and there are plenty of online resources that you can use. Predominantly we're talking about trusts, and there's search engines like Companies House, Charities Commission, paid for services like Funds Online, Funding for All, that's free. And then in terms of corporates, looking on Companies House, as has been mentioned before, looking at peer organisations to see who supports them, who the individuals are that support them. Something else as well that I don't think we've mentioned yet, if you're looking for a free resource for wealth screening, then just going on, if you've got to a point where you've got a warm relationship with a donor and you've got their contact details, looking at how much their house is valued at is a really easy way to do that, and immediately you've got a kind of ballpark figure as to what their potential donation range might be. So there are loads of things that you can do passively online, and still also call people up as well. I think I've had a lot of joy just calling people recently, if all from a home or from a static base.
Thank you. Kat and Fiona, do you have anything to add to that? Seemed pretty comprehensive, but I don't know if you've got any other ideas.
I was only going to say supporting the fundraising team as a trustee, being the person that basically makes that point of contact. It can be useful sometimes for the trustee to be the first point of contact with a donor or potential donor rather than the fundraiser. And I think being willing and able to kind of almost put your name to things if the fundraiser would find that useful. So sending out some approaches on LinkedIn, for example, to people that the fundraiser might have identified, that can be quite a useful kind of technique. And I agree, Simon, massive fan of LinkedIn and reaching out to people on that. And I've had some real success with that in the past, both in prospect research and making contact.
I've another question I've got here, and I think we're going to have to make this the last one before we wrap up, as it's nearly 10 o'clock. Does anyone have any advice for particularly successful ways to engage new trust and foundation supporters?
I mean, the classic kind of maxim is that all prospective supporters are individuals, whether they're trusts or corporates or individuals. So finding a trust and approaching them on an individual level is probably the best way to go in that regard. I actually did this by accident last night. We had a couple of donors come to an event, and it emerged that they also run a family trust, and was able to have a sort of an individual donor conversation with them about their trust. And as a result, I got a result out of it, which I wasn't expecting to at all. I was able to talk to them about a project or an area that they're interested in, and match a project that we currently do to that. And all because of the fact that we were having that very kind of traditional individual conversation. So I think that's probably the key thing to keep in mind, regardless of what the kind of the constitution is. You know, there's still an individual at the end of the phone or an email.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think a good way of kind of identifying ways that you can actually reach out to the trust once you've identified it is to go on the trustees of the trust and then search their network and see if you've got any connection to the trustees of the trust, and you can kind of approach them that way as well.
Thank you. And Kat, a final tip?
So only to reinforce just picking up the phone and having the conversation if you can, and just getting to know them and what their priorities are beyond just the written guidance on websites and things.
Well, thank you very much to all three of our speakers for a very insightful and illuminating conversation. I've certainly sort of made a few notes as I've been able to go along, and I'm looking forward to watching it back to be able to listen to the whole conversation without having to monitor it at the same time. So, you know, really, really big thanks to all of you, and to everybody listening. Our next newsletter comes out tomorrow, which will have the link to our monitoring form. So please do fill that in. Let us know how we're doing, but also it's an opportunity for you to make some suggestions for future events. We do have some plans sort of in development at the moment, so hopefully you'll hear from us very soon about what those are. And also to remind everybody that this session has been recorded, and we will be uploading it to our Vimeo channel very soon, and the link to that will also be available in our newsletter. So thank you very much to everybody, our speakers in particular, but also to everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.